This video provides a brief introduction to how you can evaluate research that's presented using historical narratives, or what are sometimes just called case studies. The main benefit of historical narrative is also its main challenge. They can be very long and rich and detailed. This is great in terms of readability. It's also great in terms of causal depth, but it can make it much more difficult to identify the parts of research that you really need to focus in on. The first thing that you need to look for is the author's hypothesis. This is rarely explicitly stated and may sometimes be couched as more of a theory than a hypothesis. So dig down and try to identify it in the author's introduction or first paragraphs of a chapter. Once you've identified that argument, that hypothesis, you need to try and break it down into a causal diagram. Sometimes authors will provide this for you. For example, Tilly, in his article, provided this causal diagram. This is actually a terrible example of a diagram because all the arrows are pointing at everything, and you don't know exactly what leads into protection or war making. This may be an accurate representation of real life where everything causes everything else, but in research we're looking for something a little more parsimonious. And while it does make compromises and is not always going to be 100% true, you want to try and draw arrows just moving in one direction. Here are examples of a broad hypothesis or theory and a causal diagram for Hui. Let me start by saying that I'm not 100% comfortable with this version of the causal diagram, but it is one version of how you could interpret her narrative. In general, her argument said that in ancient China and early modern Europe, interstate competition led to bureaucratic complexity. In China, however, leaders were able to use this bureaucracy to achieve total domination, while Europe settled into a multi-state system. The way I drew this was starting with a variable for international competition, which then led to a combination of citizenship concessions and military and economic reforms in both Europe and China. These then led to a strong state, which in China led to limitations on citizenship. Again, this is just something I drew myself. That is a first draft. It's not something that Hui gave us. But if you can break down an argument into some sort of linear graph, it's going to help you identify variables and understand what evidence you really need to look for in the argument itself. Because evaluating evidence is the last and most important thing to reading historical narratives. Now, unlike the actual practice of history, where you get really specific guidance about what's good evidence and bad evidence, I've actually never read anything like that for political science. So here are some just broad guidelines for you to go by. First, you want to look for the amount and the consistency of that evidence. In general, it's better to have more evidence supporting an argument than less, and you want to make sure that that evidence is equally applicable to all aspects of the author's theory. Because the second point here is the most important question that you need to answer. Does the evidence provided actually show each step of the causal process or the argument? To go back to the causal diagram I showed here, Hui provides a lot of information in the material I gave you, talking about citizenship concessions. She goes into great detail and has great sources for these elements. She also provides some information on military and economic reforms that were taking place at the same time. The question that you need to ask is, does she provide a lot of evidence connecting those citizenship concessions and military and economic reforms to the cause that she proposes, international competition, and the effect that she proposes, that you get a strong bureaucracy coming out of that? Those connective elements are what's really most important in these historical narratives, and they're also really the hardest thing to demonstrate. So that's what you need to look for. In general, it's better if authors are using primary sources, but oftentimes in political science, and this again is a contrast with history, you'll often be reading authors who are using secondary sources, and this is acceptable. You do want to check and see, though, how varied these sources are. You want to make sure that authors are in fact drawing information from the broadest range of sources. So those are the basics. Again, what you want to do, look for the author's core argument, draw it out so that you can identify the key steps in their causal process, and then identify the evidence that supports every link in that causal chain. That's how you read historical narratives.